This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 328 entitled, The Agent Fully Represents the Sender. So last week we began by introducing the Jewish principle of agency. This is an extremely important principle for understanding the ways in which God utilizes the persons that he sends and the roles that they carry and the way that God will empower and authorize these agents, and most importantly, at least for this podcast, the ways in which Jesus functions vis-a-vis God, the one who has sent and commissioned Jesus. So last week we introduced the Jewish principle of agency, and in doing so, we discussed 6 aspects of this particular principle. This week we're going to begin by going through each of the 6 aspects of the Jewish principle of agency, and we're going to talk this week on the first of these aspects, namely, the agent fully represents the sender. This is a crucially important aspect of setting the Bible in its Jewish context, and unfortunately it's one that many readers who aren't familiar with that Jewish context just simply overlook when it's quite clear in the passage that agency is what is being expressed. So, in what ways did Jews understand the role and function of an agent who is commissioned by a sender? What authority could the sender share with his agent? And what are some of the more noteworthy ways in which the God of Israel has used agents in the text of Scripture? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is defining our terms. So, when we talk about an agent in the sphere of the Jewish principle of agency, we have 2 particular roles. We have the agent, which is the person who is sent, and we have the sender, the one who actually has commissioned forth the agent. The Jews had a special term for this agent. In Hebrew, it is called the shaliach, which means the one who is sent. Now, there's a Greek equivalent to this. There is a verb, apostello, which means to send, and the equivalent noun is very familiar to English readers of the New Testament. That is an apostle. An apostle is one who is sent. And so this is a very common understanding among the Jewish people, and we're going to see that it was understood without having to be explained in the Old Testament. It was understood without having to be explained in the New Testament, and it was also understood without having to be explained in the Jewish writings after the New Testament. That is, in the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud. So a common refrain, it's almost like a maxim that just constantly gets repeated over and over within the post-biblical Jewish literature, is the saying about an agent, namely that a person's agent is equivalent to the person himself. I want you to hear that again. A person's agent is equivalent to the person himself. So when a person sends forth an agent, that agent fully represents the sender. And I mean fully represents the sender. That agent is equivalent to the person himself. A similar phrase that we see throughout the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud is that a man's agent is like to himself. A man's agent is like to himself. So when a man sends forth an agent, that agent is like the sender. And this is crucially important because we constantly see in the Bible that an agent has been sent, and that agent can be addressed as if that agent is actually the sender, but it would be wrong to confuse the one who is sent for the sender. That would be to misunderstand the Jewish principle of agency. So, this gets used in common everyday Jewish life. In Mishnah Berakoth, chapter 5, verse 5, it talks about how if a bad omen is going to fall upon an agent, then the bad omen falls on the one who has appointed the agent, because a man's agent is like to himself. So if someone sends forth an agent and something bad happens to the agent, it's understood that something bad has actually happened to the sender, because the agent fully represents the sender. In the Babylonian Talmud, we have a really interesting tractate, Kiddushim, and if you want to read a lot about the principle of agency, you want to read the passage which is 43a. And here it's actually going to talk about what would happen if someone sends forth an agent and the agent does something wrong. Is it understood through the principle of agency that the sender is actually liable? And that's the discussion that's actually taking place in this dialogue. It says that he who says to his agent, "Go kill so-and-so," the agent is liable. But Shammai, the elder, says in the name of the prophet Haggai, the one who sends him is liable as well. And in order to justify this, Shammai, who was a very famous Pharisaical teacher in the first century, the Apostle Paul knew him, actually cites 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 9 as proof of the principle that he's trying to indicate here. So we have a first century Jewish Pharisee who is teaching the principle of agency. In order to justify it, he is citing from the Hebrew Bible. He's citing from 2 Samuel chapter 12. Now, later in that particular tractate, we have the phrase that I already quoted, which is that a person's agent is equivalent to the person himself. That, of course, really demonstrates the fullness in which the agent represents the sender. And then we also see that a sender can commission forth an agent to function as a witness on behalf of the sender. So the agent can show up and actually be the person who speaks and says, "Hey, I witnessed and I actually saw something," when the agent actually didn't see it. It was actually the sender of the agent who is the witness. And we read, according to the Babylonian Talmud, that the decided law is an agent may serve as a witness. A sender can send an agent, and when the sender is the actual witness, he can actually have his agent function as his witness in a law court setting. Now, the agent could be someone of equal status. It could be a family member, like a father could send forth a son. A father could send forth a hired servant who works for him. And also an agent could be someone with a very low status, like a slave. And when the sender would send forth a slave, that slave was to be treated according to the status, not of a slave, but in regard to the sender who commissioned forth the slave. We read this in Babylonian Talmud Gittin 23a and b. So we have all these examples, and we've already seen some suggestions that the Jews are drawing this from the Old Testament. We could see some examples of this. So in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 40, we have David coming to meet Abigail in order that Abigail would come to marry David. But David doesn't actually come himself because, well, he's the king, and the king's got busy things to do. So what does David do? David sends forth his agents. So let's read this passage. 1 Samuel 25, starting in verse 40. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they spoke to her, saying, "David has sent us to you to take you as his wife." She arose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, "Behold, your maidservant is a maid to wash the feet of my Lord's servants." That's 1 Samuel 25, verses 40 through 41. So David is summoning Abigail because he wants to take her as his wife. And so he sends forth the agents. The agents acknowledge this to say, David has sent us, and we are going to take you to be his wife. And Abigail recognizes this. She actually bows down to the servants because they fully represent the one who sent them. They represent David. And she says, look, I'm a maid servant, and I'm going to wash the feet of my Lord's servants. So she treats the servants with the honor and the authority and the recognition that David the king would expect if he was there in person. When he sends forth the agents, they are due the same authority. They are to be honored in the same way that David is to be honored. Why is that? It's because the agent fully represents the sender. Now, what happens when a sender sends forth agents and they disrespect the agent? What we're going to see is that the sender is also disrespected because the agent who represents the sender is being treated unfavorably. So in 2 Samuel chapter 10, starting in verse 2, it says, Then David said, I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent some of his servants to console him concerning his father. But when David's servants came to the land of the Amorites, the princes of the Amorites said to Hanun, their lord, Do you think that David is honoring your father because he has sent consolers to you? Has David not sent his servants to you in order to search the city, to spy it out and overthrow it? So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half of their beards and cut off their garments in the middle as far as their hips and sent them away. So when they told it to David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly humiliated. And that's 2 Samuel chapter 10, verses 2 through 5. David sends forth his servants, and David has good intentions. He wants to console this new king because his father had recently died. He wants to show kindness to him. He says, I will show kindness to him just as his father had shown kindness to me. So David sends forth his agents, but they disrespect the agents. They cut off half of their beards, and they cut their garments, and they send them away, and they were greatly humiliated. And so David actually gets very angry at this because when you humiliate the agents, you are humiliating the one who sent the agents. Why is this? Answer, the agents fully represent the sender. So we can see that these stories are just already there. They're interwoven throughout the narrative of the Hebrew Bible, and they don't have to be explained. They don't come out and tell the reader that, hey, this is the Jewish principle of agency. It was something that was understood in the culture. When someone sent forth an envoy, that envoy was to be respected as if the envoy was the sender himself. This is something that was clear in Jewish culture. It was clear in Greek culture. It was clear in Roman culture. And it was quite well understood in the ancient Near East. This moves us to our second point. Point number 2, an important footnote about the agent. And this is something that I really would like to spend some more time on, but we don't really have the time in this episode to look at. But it is important to note that an agent who has already been commissioned by his sender can send forth other agents. So the best example of this is in the Synoptic Gospels, to where God, of course, sends Jesus on the Messianic mission, and Jesus is going to summon the 12, and then he sends the 12 out. So you have God who has sent Jesus, and Jesus sent the 12, and Jesus will say, if they reject you, he's talking to the 12, if they reject you, then they reject me, and if they reject me, they reject him who sent me. And so you can see that you have an agent is able to commission forth other agents. And Jesus actually sends out disciples calling them apostles, remember the ones who are sent several times in this ministry, if we just strictly look at the Gospel of John, where sending language is quite common, I think it appears 61 times in the Gospel of John, 7 of those, a little bit over 10%, are in reference to the disciples being sent. And 6 of those 7 times, the disciples are sent prior to Jesus' death. This is Jesus, the one who is sent, is actually sending forth his own disciples. An agent can commission forth his own agents. And there's one example after his death, which is really important. In John 20, verse 21, where Jesus says, "As the Father has sent me, I now send you." Very clearly indicating that Jesus is the agent of the Father, and now his disciples are agents of the agent. So it's a really important footnote that we kind of want to keep in the back of our mind and consider. We can already see it there in the New Testament, but it's important to realize that an agent is so committed to the mission of the sender that he's actually able to employ other agents to help fulfill that particular role and commissioning. So let's get to the most exciting part, point number 3, which is examples in Scripture. So where do we see God using agents in a manner that portrays the agents as fully representing the sender? We've got several examples. We've got dozens of examples, but I kind of want to go through, how many do I have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 major ones. So the first one, this is 3a, is in reference to heavenly angels. And I really need to make sure that this point is really clear to the listeners, because I get the impression when I talk to people online or I talk to people that are interested in the Bible that they don't know this particular point. And the point that I'm going to say is that an angel, by definition, is a messenger. An angel, by definition, is a messenger. So the word for angel in Hebrew could be translated as a angel, that is a heavenly messenger, or it could just be a human messenger. But either way, they are messengers. They are agents. An angel, at least a heavenly angel, is a heavenly agent. The angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, is an agent of Yahweh. That's really important. And the same thing in the New Testament. The Greek noun angelos could refer to a heavenly angel, or it could refer to a human messenger. But they're both messengers who function as agents. So the writers of the Bible assume you already know that. So if you don't know that, you're just not going to make sense of these sort of passages. So here we can see a couple of places where the principle of agency actually appears. So in Exodus chapter 3, this is where Moses comes to the burning bush. Starting in verse 2, it says, "The angel of Yahweh appeared to Moses, in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed." And then the angel of Yahweh in the bush starts talking, and he says in verse 6, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So that's Exodus chapter 3, verses 2 through 6. If you read it carefully, what we actually have there is the angel of Yahweh that's there in the burning bush. So that the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in the fire of the bush. So this is the heavenly messenger of Yahweh, and the messenger of Yahweh is an agent who fully represents the sender. So the agent can actually say, "I am the God of your father. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses, seeing this agent and knowing that the agent represents the sender, was afraid to look at, quote, God. Not that the angel himself is God. The agent has not collapsed with the sender, and now the agent actually is the sender. No, the agent fully represents the sender in the Jewish principle of agency. That much is clear. Here's another example involving angels. Exodus 23, 20 through 21, where Yahweh says, "Behold, I am going to send an angel before you." to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Be on your guard before him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious towards him, for he will not pardon your transgression, since my name is in him. That's Exodus 23, verses 20 through 21. So Yahweh is speaking. He says he's going to send his agent before them. That's what an angel is, a messenger, an agent. Yahweh says, I'm going to send my agent. He's going to bring you to the place that I have prepared. So when Yahweh is speaking about this agent, he makes sure to distinguish what Yahweh himself has done and what the agent's going to do. The agent's going to bring them into the place that Yahweh has prepared. You're to obey his voice. Why are you to do that? Because he's an authorized agent. You obey him in the same way you would obey Yahweh. And then we see that God has placed his authoritative name in this angel. Is this angel the angel of Yahweh? Possibly. But Yahweh shares his name with many of his agents. But the text is clear. There's no confusion as if this is actually one single person. No, we have Yahweh, one person, speaking in the first person. I am going to send. And then we have his agent, an angel, a messenger that fully represents the sender. So that's the first example, heavenly angels. Second example is prophets, spokespersons for the one true God. One of the most famous prophets in the Hebrew Bible is none other than Moses. And Moses represents God so much that Moses can actually be called God. So in Exodus chapter 7, verses 1 through 2, it says, Then Yahweh said to Moses, See, I make you God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you. That's Exodus chapter 7, verses 1 through 2. So this is Yahweh empowering the prophet Moses in order that Moses himself represents Yahweh to the point that he can be called God. This is a human being who is called God in a way that God approves. God approves of this. Yahweh approves of this because of the principle of agency. Yahweh says to Moses, I make you God to Pharaoh. You're going to speak all that I command you. Because Moses is the prophetic agent of God. And of course, the agent fully represents the sender. But this is clear. Human beings can be called God. And if you don't believe this, go grab a lexicon. Go grab the BDAG lexicon. Go grab Brown, Driver, and Briggs. Go grab the Halot lexicon and just look up the entries for God. And you're going to see human beings are listed there as people that God allows to be called God. And of course, prophets are constantly saying, Thus says the Lord, thus says Yahweh. They're actually sitting there speaking on behalf of God, and they'll actually start speaking in the first person. They'll start saying the things that God is saying, but they'll start speaking them in the third person. They won't say, well, this is what Yahweh says. They'll actually start saying, I this, I that, as if Yahweh is directly speaking through these prophetic agents. So that much is clear. And of course, if you listen to the prophets, you're listening to God. But if you reject the prophets, if you harm the prophets, if you spurn the prophets, if you kill the prophets, then you are rejecting the God who has sent them. So it's quite clear that prophets are easily understood as agents of the true God. The third example is kings, royalty, those who rule on thrones. So a great example is in Micah chapter 5, verse 4. This is a familiar phrase to Christians, especially in reading Matthew chapter 2, where you have the reference to the son of David that's going to come from Bethlehem. But in Micah chapter 5, verse 4, it talks about this king, and it says that he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of Yahweh, in the majesty of the name of Yahweh, his God. That's Micah chapter 5, verse 4. So we have the king, who is a descendant of David, which means that he's a human being, and he is going to shepherd his flock. He's going to be a shepherd king, just like David was. But how is he going to do this? Is he going to do it in his own strength? No, he's going to do it in the strength of Yahweh, and he's going to bear the name of Yahweh. And then it makes it clear that this agent has Yahweh as his God. So we have a king functioning as the ruling agent of Yahweh, and the king represents Yahweh to the point to where Yahweh is actually empowering this agent with his own strength. He's going to shepherd the flock in the strength of Yahweh, and he's going to have the majesty of the name of Yahweh. But it makes it clear that Yahweh is his God. The agent's going to have the name of Yahweh, but he's not actually Yahweh. Yahweh is his God. He's just bearing the prerogative of the majesty of the name of Yahweh. But he's an agent. He's a ruling agent. He is a king. And, of course, the agent fully represents the sender. The king, who rules correctly, is fully going to represent Yahweh, the one who is his God. And we can see something similar to this in 1 Chronicles 29:23, where Solomon, who is ruling from Jerusalem, sitting on the throne that has been covenanted to David, it says Solomon sat on the throne of Yahweh. Solomon sat on the throne of Yahweh, 1 Chronicles 29:23. A lot of people just read over this and they don't see actually what is taking place. Solomon, the human being, is not sitting on a throne in heaven. He's not sitting on Yahweh's throne up there in the sky. He's sitting on the Davidic throne that is geographically positioned in Jerusalem. But Yahweh is sharing his rule with this king because this king is ruling on behalf of Yahweh. So much so that Solomon sits on the throne of Yahweh. Yahweh shares his rule with this human king. Yahweh shares his throne with this human king, despite the fact that this human being is not up there in heaven. This is because this king is the ruling agent of Yahweh. He rules on Yahweh's behalf, and the agent, as a king, fully represents the sender. So we've got angels, we've got prophets, we've got kings. Fourth one is going to be judges, the human rulers who judge on behalf of God. So God is the ultimate judge. He's the cosmic judge, but he empowers a variety of human judges to function as rulers and those that are going to settle disputes and vindicate the helpless within the Hebrew Bible. It's also there in the New Testament. It's also part of the promises of the kingdom of God that the faithful will judge the world with Jesus. So some interesting passages in Exodus. In Exodus chapter 22, starting in verse 8, it gives kind of a mundane issue about a thief and what's going to happen to them, and if you take him to the judges, what actually is going to take place. So in Exodus 22:8, it says, "If the thief is not caught, then the owner of the house shall appear before the judges to determine whether he laid his hands on his neighbor's property." So that's Exodus 22, verse 8. What's going on in this passage? It says the owner of the house will appear before the judges. And the judges are going to determine whether the owner has actually laid his hands on the property of his neighbor. But the word for judges in Hebrew is Elohim. So these judges are called God because they are judging on behalf of God. They are God's judging agents, and they fully represent the sender. So much so that these human beings are also called God, just like we saw with Moses in Exodus chapter 7, verse 1. And it's very clear that it's not truly God that's meant by this. It actually is referring to human judges that are functioning as judging agents. In the next verse, 22:9, it says, "For every breach of trust, whether it is for ox, donkey, sheep, clothing, or for any lost thing about which one says, 'This is it,' the case of both parties shall come before the judges. He whom the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. That's 22 verse 9. So twice in this passage we have the word judges. And in both those cases it has in Hebrew Elohim, the word for God. Both parties shall come before God, and then he whom the gods condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. Now, why did I say gods there? Because the verb to condemn is third person masculine plural. That's how we know that it does refer to plural judges, and it's not just Elohim, the word for the one God, because it has a plural verb, so it's referring to plural persons. And it's very clear in this passage and in the previous passage that the people are coming before these human judges in order to settle various civic disputes. That's what they're doing. But there, 3 times over the course of 2 verses, the judges, human rulers, are just casually called God. And it's not even explained to the reader. It's just assuming that you already know this, because judges represent the sender. Judges are agents of God's rule and his just reign. So judges can be called God. In fact, they are multiple times. So judges can be called God. Prophets can be called God. Human kings can be called God. We didn't look at this, but in Psalm 45, verses 6 through 7, we can see the human kings that are called God. But this is all going to culminate in our final example, which is the Son of God. So, if the Son of God is functioning as a prophet, if the Son of God is a judge, if the Son of God is a king, then certainly he's going to function as the premier agent of the only true God. And we know that he is because he is the one who is sent. In the Gospel of John, it is quite clear that God is the one who has sent Jesus, and Jesus is the one who has been sent by God. This means Jesus is the agent of God. And if he's the agent, then he fully represents the sender. He's also sent in the synoptics, and the best example of seeing how this works is in the parable of the wicked tenants, sometimes called the parable of the vineyard in Mark chapter 12, and its parallels to where you have the owner of the vineyard. He sends forth a bunch of servants, and then finally he sends forth the son, saying, "Oh, I'm sending forth my son, surely they'll listen to him." And then they reject the son, and ultimately it's seen as rejecting the sender. So, the Son of God is someone who is sent. That means that he's an agent. The one who sends him is described as the one who sent Jesus, especially in the Gospel of John. So you have this sense to where Jesus is the agent. He's the one who has been sent. And you have God as the one who sends Jesus, so he is the sender. That's clearly the Jewish principle of agency. We can see that Jesus comes in his Father's name. And the people even recognize this when Jesus comes into Jerusalem in the triumphal entry. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh." And Jesus says, on his own account, in the Gospel of John, "I have come in my Father's name." This is what an agent would say, a true agent. And because Jesus, as the agent, fully represents the sender, this means that he can bear the titles and the privileges and the prerogatives of the sender. This is why I'm not bothered by the fact that Jesus is called God in John 20:28. So the Father is called God in the New Testament like 1,320 times and change. And then Jesus is called God twice. Once in John 20:28 and the other one in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. But when Jesus is called God, he's not confused with the only true God. And Jesus called the Father the only true God in John 17:3. And Jesus, in the context, said that he has a God above him, the supreme God, in John 20, verse 17. But Jesus, the agent, who fully represents the sender, according to the principle of agency and the concept that everyone understood, he, as the agent, represents the sender and can be called by the title of the sender. If Moses can be called God because Moses was a prophet, then Jesus can be called God because Jesus is a prophet. If the judges can be called God, if the Davidic king can be called God, then Jesus can be called God as well. Not that he would be confused with the true God. The Gospel of John makes clear that there's a distinction between the one who sins and the one who is sent. So that's my case for it. We see that Jesus, as the agent, shares in God's prerogatives. Of course he does. So Jesus forgives sins, not because he is God, because God has given that authority to Jesus. Jesus also exercises the judgment of God, not because he is God, but because God has given the judgment to the Son. We see that whenever the issue shows up. Whenever there's a question over how is it that Jesus can forgive sins and how is it that he can judge, it's stated that God has given this authority to Jesus, not that Jesus innately possesses it. He has it because he's the agent, and the agent fully represents the sender. In the book of Revelation, Jesus has some of the titles of God, Alpha and Omega, beginning and the end. That's no problem. He's the highly exalted and risen Lord. And as the agent, he represents God, and so the agent can be described with the titles of the sender. That's pretty common, pretty easy to see. It's consistent with the Jewish principle of agency. And Jesus shares in God's name. We already saw this, that an angel has God's name in him. And then in Philippians 2:9, after the resurrection of Jesus, God highly exalts Jesus, and God gives to Jesus the name that is above every name. That's in Philippians 2:9. So there you have it. We have, through the Old Testament and in the New Testament and in the Jewish literature in the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud, after the New Testament, the Jewish principle of agency, it is all over the place. It is so common, and it's just there under the assumption that you already know it and you recognize it and you're going to take it seriously. And if you don't, then you're going to make the fundamental error of confusing the agent for the one who sent him. And that would be a most fundamental error for anyone to make in the ancient Near East. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we continue to examine the Jewish principle of agency. We'll look at the second tenet, where the agent functions in judicial matters belonging solely to the sender. Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths of the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing on YouTube or iTunes, by giving us an honest review online, and by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. If you'd like to offer financial donation, you can check out the episode description for a PayPal link. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.